The letter in Josephine Clark's trembling hand had promised a new beginning. But as the stagecoach rumbled to a stop in the dusty town of El Dorado, Colorado, she wondered if she had made the gravest mistake of her life. The year was 1875, and the frontier town looked nothing like the bustling center of opportunity described in William Olsen's advertisement seeking a bride. Josephine smoothed the wrinkles from her navy traveling dress and adjusted her spectacles, tucking a stray strand of chestnut hair beneath her bonnet. At 22, with a teaching certificate and 3 years of experience at a Boston academy for young ladies, she had been deemed too educated and too opinionated by the gentlemen of her hometown. When her father died leaving substantial debts, she'd had few options. William Olsen's advertisement had seemed like providence. Miss Clark. A tall man approached the stagecoach, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dusty but well-kept, and he stood with a certain confidence that immediately caught her attention. Mr. Olsen. She asked, accepting his outstretched hand as she descended from the coach. William Olsen, madam, welcome to El Dorado. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, with a gentle drawl that spoke of years in the West. As he tipped his hat back, she could see his face clearly sun-weathered with kind blue eyes and a strong jawline framed by a neatly trimmed beard. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense, but there was something compelling about him. "I hope your journey wasn't too uncomfortable," he said, collecting her trunk from the stagecoach driver. "It was. Educational," Josephine replied diplomatically, recalling the cramped quarters and rough terrain. "I've never traveled so far west before." William nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Well, there's plenty more education to be had out here, though probably not the kind you're used to." As they walked toward a wagon parked nearby, William gestured around the main street. "This is El Dorado. Not much to look at compared to Boston, I reckon, but it's growing. We've got the general store, the saloon which you should avoid the sheriff's office, and Mrs. Peterson's boarding house serves the best meals in the territory." Josephine took in the wooden buildings, the unpaved streets, and the mountains rising in the distance. It was beautiful in its own way, wild and untamed. "Your letters didn't mention how magnificent the landscape is," she said. William seemed surprised by her observation. "I suppose I've gotten used to it. The ranch is even better, sits in a valley with a creek running through it. You'll see tomorrow. Tonight I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Peterson's. Thought you might want a proper rest before heading out to the ranch." The consideration touched her. "Thank you, Mr. Olsen, that's very thoughtful." "William, pleased," he corrected gently. "If we're to be married, we ought to be on familiar terms." The mention of their impending marriage sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. "Yes, of course. William, Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with lace curtains and a small garden, a touch of civilization in the frontier town. The older woman greeted them warmly, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. "So you're the bride from Boston, Mrs. Peterson exclaimed, looking Josephine up and down. "My, aren't you a proper lady? William's been fixing up that old ranch house for weeks now, even added some bookshelves, said his bride was educated." William cleared his throat, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Mrs. Peterson, Miss Clark is probably tired from her journey." Of course," the woman said with a knowing smile. "I've prepared the blue room. Dinner's at 6. William carried Josephine's trunk upstairs, setting it down carefully in a small but clean room with blue checked curtains. "I'll come for you tomorrow morning around 9. We can talk more then." Josephine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. "Thank you for the arrangements. I look forward to seeing your ranch." After William left, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, her future stretching before her like the vast Colorado landscape, beautiful, intimidating, and utterly unknown. The next morning, Josephine rose early, donning a practical brown dress for the journey to the ranch. At breakfast, Mrs. Peterson regaled her with stories about William. "He's a good man, that William Olsen," Mrs. Peterson said, pouring coffee. "Came here 5 years ago with nothing but determination, built that ranch from scratch, never seen a man work harder. What can you tell me about his expectations?" Josephine asked carefully. Mrs. Peterson's eyes softened. He's not like some men out here looking for just a housekeeper or, well, you know, he wants a partner, someone to build a life with. Don't let his quiet ways fool you, there's depth there. William arrived precisely at 9, driving a well-maintained wagon. He had shaved and wore a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "Good morning, Josephine," he said, helping her into the wagon. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." As they left El Dorado behind, William pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days in Colorado. He had come from Pennsylvania after the war, looking for a fresh start. "The war changed everything," he said quietly. "Couldn't go back to the way things were before." "You fought for the Union?" Josephine asked. William nodded. "Pennsylvania 83rd Infantry, saw things no man should see." He fell silent for a moment, then changed the subject. "What about you? Your letters mentioned teaching." Josephine described her education at a women's seminary and her years teaching at the academy. "I've always loved learning and sharing knowledge with others. My father encouraged it, though my mother worried it would make me unsuitable for marriage." William's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Is that why you answered my advertisement? No suitors in Boston." "There were suitors," Josephine admitted, "but they wanted a different kind of wife, one who wouldn't correct their grammar or discuss politics at dinner parties." She smiled wryly. "Apparently, gentlemen find an educated woman threatening." To her surprise, William chuckled. "Their loss, I'd say." The wagon crested a hill, and suddenly the ranch came into view. A modest but well-built house stood in a green valley with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings nearby. A creek sparkled in the sunlight and cattle grazed on the surrounding hillsides. "It's not much," William said, a note of uncertainty in his voice, "but it's good land." "It's beautiful," Josephine replied honestly. "Truly." As they approached the house, a dog came bounding out to meet them, followed by a young boy of about 14. "That's Jake," William explained. "My ranch hand. Orphaned in a Cheyenne raid a few years back, he helps with the cattle and chores." Jake approached the wagon cautiously, eyeing Josephine with undisguised curiosity. "This her, Mr. Olsen, your mail-order bride." William winced at the blunt description. "This is Miss Clark, Jake. Mind your manners." Josephine smiled at the boy, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Jake. I hope we'll be friends." Jake awkwardly shook her hand, mumbling a greeting before retreating to the barn with the dog at his heels. "He's a good boy," William said. "Just not used to ladies." "Few seem to be out here," Josephine observed. William led her into the house, which was simple but surprisingly comfortable. The main room contained a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and, true to Mrs. Peterson's word, newly built bookshelves, currently empty. "I thought you might have books," William explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "From Boston." "I do," Josephine confirmed. "I couldn't leave them behind." William showed her the rest of the house, the kitchen with its cast iron stove, the small bedroom that would be hers until the wedding, and his own room across the hall. Everything was clean and well-maintained, if Spartan. "I know it's not what you're used to," William said, standing awkwardly in the main room. "If you've changed your mind, I'd understand. I could take you back to town tomorrow." The sincerity in his voice touched Josephine. "I haven't changed my mind," she said. "But I would like to know more about you, William Olsen, beyond what was in your letters." William nodded, gesturing toward the table. "That's fair enough. Let's sit." Over the next hour, they talked more openly than in their correspondence. William described his ranch, his hopes for expanding, and his dream of building a larger house someday. Josephine spoke of her father's death, the debts that had forced her to leave Boston, and her fears about surviving on the frontier. "I'm not skilled in the domestic arts," she admitted. "My mother despaired of my cooking," William laughed. "I've been feeding myself and Jake for years. We won't starve, but there is something." He hesitated. "In your letters, you mentioned loving books, poetry. I never had much schooling, but I've always wanted to learn more. Maybe you could read to me sometimes." "In the evenings," the request surprised her. "You want me to read to you?" William looked down at his calloused hands. "I can read some basic words and such, but those fancy books you mentioned, Shakespeare and Dickens, I wouldn't know where to start." "My pa always said book learning was a waste for a man who works with his hands, but I never believed that." In that moment, Josephine saw William Olsen clearly for the first time, not just a rugged rancher, but a man with depths and desires beyond the practical necessities of frontier life. A man who valued knowledge enough to welcome an overeducated bride when others had rejected her for the same quality. "I would be honored to read to you, William," she said softly. The days before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Josephine learned the rhythms of ranch life, from the early morning milking to the evening chores. William taught her to gather eggs without agitating the hens and how to tell when bread dough had risen properly. In return, each evening after dinner, Josephine would select a book from her collection and read aloud by lamplight. She started with David Copperfield, watching William's face as Dickens' world came alive in the cozy ranch house. Sometimes Jake would linger, pretending indifference but clearly absorbed in the story. William never interrupted except to ask the meaning of an unfamiliar word, which he would repeat carefully, committing it to memory. One evening, a week before the wedding, Josephine was reading a particularly emotional passage when she glanced up to find William watching her, not with the usual concentration of someone following a story, but with a look of wonder directed at her. "What is it?" she asked, setting the book down. "Just thinking how different you are from what I expected," he admitted. "When I placed that advertisement, I thought I needed a practical woman who could cook and clean and maybe bear children someday. I never imagined someone like you. Someone too educated." Josephine asked, a hint of old hurt in her voice. "No," William said firmly. "Someone who could bring beauty into this life with just her voice and a book. Someone who makes me see the world differently." The words hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "I'm finding ranch life different from what I expected too," she confessed. "There's a different kind of education here, practical wisdom I never learned from books." William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape. "Josephine, I want you to know something. Our agreement was for marriage, and I still hope for that. But if you're having second thoughts, if this life is too hard or too lonely, I won't hold you to it." Josephine joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth of him without touching. "Are you having second thoughts, William?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "No, madam, I am not." "Then neither am I." The simple exchange felt more binding than any formal engagement. That night, Josephine lay awake in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, and realized that somewhere between Boston and El Dorado, her notion of home had begun to change. The morning before the wedding, Josephine was in the kitchen attempting to master a pie crust when Mrs. Peterson arrived with several women from town. "Couldn't let you get married without a proper gathering of ladies," Mrs. Peterson declared, setting down baskets of food. "This is Mrs. Allen, Mrs. Foster, and Miss Tompkins, our schoolteacher." The women surveyed Josephine with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Allen, a plump woman with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Mrs. Peterson says you were a teacher back east, at some fancy school." "The Fairview Academy for Young Ladies," Josephine confirmed, wiping flour from her hands. "I taught literature and composition." Mrs. Allen exchanged glances with Mrs. Foster. "And you're choosing to marry William Olsen, a rancher." Something in her tone made Josephine straighten her spine. "I am, with great pleasure and expectation." Miss Tompkins, a woman closer to Josephine's age, smiled encouragingly. "Don't mind them. They're just surprised William found someone so educated," Mrs. Foster supplied. "Folks were betting he'd end up with someone more practical." "I assure you I'm learning practicality quickly," Josephine replied, gesturing to her flour-covered apron. Mrs. Peterson chuckled. "She's fitting in just fine, and William's happier than I've ever seen him." "Well, Mrs. Allen sniffed. "Education doesn't keep a man warm at night or put food on the table." Josephine felt a flush of anger. "No, but it can enrich a life beyond mere survival. William values that, even if others don't." An awkward silence fell, broken when Miss Tompkins changed the subject. "I hear you brought books with you. I'd love to see them sometime. Our school library is woefully inadequate." The conversation moved to safer topics, but Josephine couldn't help noticing the skeptical glances. These women didn't believe she would last, and perhaps they were right to doubt. What did a Boston-educated teacher know about being a rancher's wife? When William returned from town with supplies, he found Josephine sitting alone on the porch, lost in thought. "Everything all right?" he asked. Setting down his packages, Josephine hesitated. "The ladies from town came to call. They seem to think I'm unsuited for ranch life, too educated to be happy here." William's jaw tightened. "People talk without knowing. They did the same when I bought this land," said a Union soldier from Pennsylvania, had no business ranching in Colorado. "And now they come to me for advice on cattle breeding." He sat beside her on the porch step. "Josephine, I never wanted someone who'd just keep house. I wanted a partner, someone with a mind of her own. Even if that mind is filled with poetry and literature instead of recipes and darning techniques." William smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his face. "Especially then. I can learn recipes, but that spark in you when you're reading, when you're thinking, that can't be taught." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Josephine realized she had found something she never expected. A man who valued her mind as much as her potential as a wife. The wedding took place the next day in El Dorado's small church. Josephine wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that had been packed carefully in her trunk. William, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new shirt and string tie, watched her walk down the aisle with a look of such reverence that she nearly stumbled. The ceremony was brief, the reception at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house modest but cheerful. Even Mrs. Allen seemed to have softened her judgment, particularly after seeing the way William looked at his bride. As they drove back to the ranch, their ranch now, Josephine felt a strange mixture of nervousness and contentment. "Mrs. Olsen," William said, testing the name, "has a nice sound to it." "It does," Josephine agreed, "though I hope you won't mind if I still correct your grammar occasionally." William laughed. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." That night, after the awkwardness of new intimacy gave way to tenderness, they lay together in the darkness of what was now their shared bedroom. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another. "Will you read something?" William asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "One of your poems, maybe." Josephine reached for the small volume of Keats she had placed on the bedside table, opening it by the light of a single candle. She found Bright Star and began to read, her voice gaining confidence with each line. When she finished, William was silent for so long she wondered if he had fallen asleep. "That's how I feel," he finally said. "Like I want to be steadfast, unchangeable, watching over you." Josephine set the book aside and turned to face him, marveling at this man who could find himself in centuries-old poetry. "I never thought I'd find someone who would want me to read to them every night," she whispered. "I never thought I'd find someone who would make words come alive," he replied, pulling her closer. "We're both lucky then." The seasons changed, and Josephine adapted to ranch life more easily than anyone, including herself, had expected. She learned to make soap from lye, to preserve vegetables for winter, to predict weather changes from the behavior of animals. Her first attempts at cooking were disasters, but William ate every burnt biscuit and oversalted stew without complaint. In return, she transformed their modest home with small touches: curtains sewn from fabric ordered from Denver, a braided rug before the fireplace, and bookshelves that gradually filled as they ordered volumes from catalogs. Each evening, no matter how exhausting the day had been, they maintained their ritual of reading together. William's vocabulary expanded rapidly, and he began to participate more actively, asking questions about the stories and sometimes challenging the characters' decisions. Jake, who had initially been wary of Josephine, became a regular participant, sprawled on the floor with the dog as she read adventures that transported them far beyond the Colorado frontier. As winter approached, Miss Tompkins fell ill with pneumonia, and the town council approached Josephine about temporarily taking over the school. "I'd have to ride into town daily," she told William that night, "and I'd have less time for household duties." William considered this. "Jake and I managed before you came. We can manage again. Besides, you're a teacher. You shouldn't waste that gift. Some would say a woman's place is in her home, caring for her husband." William snorted. "Some would say a lot of foolish things. You care for me plenty. But you've got more to offer than just keeping house." So Josephine began teaching at the small school in El Dorado, riding in each morning on a gentle mare William had trained specifically for her. The children, initially suspicious of her fancy Eastern ways, soon warmed to her engaging teaching style and the exciting stories she incorporated into their lessons. When Miss Tompkins recovered, the town council offered Josephine a permanent position sharing the teaching duties. The school had grown too large for one teacher anyway, they explained, and the children had progressed remarkably under her tutelage. "You should accept," William urged when she hesitated. "You light up when you talk about teaching. But what about our plans for expanding the ranch?" "The extra cattle you wanted to buy," William took her hands in his. "We'll still do all that, just might take a little longer. Some things are worth waiting for." As spring returned to the valley, Josephine discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and apprehension. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, and the nearest doctor was in Denver. "We'll manage," William assured her, though she could see the worry behind his confident smile. "Mrs. Peterson has delivered half the babies in the county." On a warm August evening, after 18 hours of labor, Josephine gave birth to a son they named James, after her father. William, who had paced outside until Mrs. Peterson finally allowed him in, held his son with trembling hands, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the baby to Josephine's arms, "just like his mother." Motherhood brought new challenges, but Josephine adapted as she had to everything else on the frontier. She reduced her teaching to 2 days a week, bringing baby James with her. The students, particularly the girls, adored the infant, and Josephine used his presence to incorporate practical lessons in child development and care education that would serve them well in their future lives. In the evenings, their reading ritual expanded to include stories for James. William would hold the baby while Josephine read, sometimes children's tales, sometimes passages from the classics, believing that even an infant could benefit from the rhythm and beauty of language. "He won't understand the words," William pointed out one evening as she read from The Tempest. "It doesn't matter," Josephine replied. "He'll hear the music in them, and he'll grow up knowing that stories matter, that words have power." William nodded thoughtfully. "Like I've learned." As James grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy 4-year-old, the ranch prospered. William's careful management and innovative breeding techniques had expanded their herd, and they were able to build the larger house he had dreamed of, with a dedicated library that became the heart of their home. Word spread about the reading rancher and his educated wife, and neighbors would often visit on winter evenings to join the reading circle. Even Mrs. Allen, who had been so skeptical of Josephine's suitability, became a regular, admitting that she had developed a taste for Mr. Dickens' stories. When James turned 5, Josephine discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and on a crisp autumn day, she gave birth to twin girls, Elena and Margaret. 3 children, William marveled, watching James cautiously touch his sister's tiny fingers. And a successful ranch, and the finest teacher in Colorado. How did a simple rancher get so lucky? Perhaps by valuing what others dismissed, Josephine suggested, remembering the skepticism she had faced. By seeing that an educated woman could be more than a liability. One evening when the twins were 2 and James 7, a visitor arrived at the ranch, a journalist from Denver writing about successful frontier enterprises. "I've heard about your operation," the man explained, accepting the coffee Josephine offered. "One of the most profitable in the region, they say. I want to know your secret, Mr. Olsen." William glanced at Josephine, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when he was amused. "No real secret, sir. Hard work, good land, and the best partner a man could ask for." The journalist looked skeptical. "Most men I interview credit new breeding techniques, irrigation methods, that sort of thing." "Oh, we use those too," William acknowledged. "But the foundation of our success, education. My wife has taught me that learning never stops, that there's wisdom in books as well as experience." The journalist raised an eyebrow at Josephine. "Unusual perspective for a rancher." "My husband is an unusual man," Josephine replied proudly. "He asked me to read to him when others thought I was too educated to be a proper wife." Later, after the children were asleep and they sat together by the fire, William with a ledger and Josephine with a new novel, she reflected on how far they had come from their uncertain beginning. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Sending for a bride and getting a blue stocking instead, William set down his pencil. "Regret getting the greatest blessing of my life. No, Josephine, not for a single moment." He moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking the book from her hands. "Do you remember the first night you read to me? David Copperfield, Chapter 1. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show," Josephine quoted from memory. William nodded. "I've thought about that line often. Before you came, I was living but not really being the hero of my own life. Just existing, working, surviving. You taught me to want more, to see more, to be more. We taught each other," Josephine corrected gently. "I learned about resilience, about finding joy in simple things, about building something real with my hands and heart." Outside, the Colorado night was filled with stars, brighter than Josephine had ever seen in Boston. Inside, the home they had created together was warm with love and learning, a place where education was valued alongside practical skills, where books shared space with cattle ledgers, where an educated bride had found not just acceptance but celebration of her mind. "Read to me," William asked, as he had that first night and countless nights since. Josephine opened the book, cleared her throat, and began to read, her voice filling their home with words that, like their love, had bridged worlds and defied expectations. "It is a truth universally acknowledged," she read, "that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." William's laughter joined hers, both of them thinking how far from universal such truths really were, and how fortunate they had been to discover their own truth, that sometimes the most perfect match is the one others claim won't work at all.